Up in the northeast of England, specifically within County Durham, there is a landmark known as the Worm Well. Now, there is a bit of a paradox here. A simple act of laziness, skipping church on a Sunday, created a monster that actually outlived the man who caused it. This is the tale of the Lambton worm, an English legend that's become so integral to the lore and culture of the Northeast that it's actually taught in schools. I think it's worth exploring how a thumb-sized eel caught in the River Wear became a generational nightmare. Lambton Castle stood on a hill overlooking rolling fields, farms, and villages in England's northern valleys. It was a quiet place. The stone towers watched over an area where people lived by the seasons and chapel bells. If you visit the northeast of England today, you can still walk the Lambton Worm Walk and see the River Wear. You'll also find the Penshaw Monument. This monument was built in 1844 in honor of George Lambton, the first Earl of Durham. It's a Victorian copy, a replica of a temple in Greece, the Temple of Theseum in Athens, though it's half the size of the original. In the early versions of the story, the monster's home was Worm Hill in Fatfield. Later songs shifted the location to Penshaw Hill, where the monument now stands. The river was silent back then, and that is the kind of silence that usually precedes a very large mistake. John Lambton, of the aristocratic Lambton family from County Durham, was not exactly the model heir. Oh no. As the heir of Lambton Castle, he was more of a troublemaker who didn't always follow the rules. He was a wild young fellow, spending his Saturday nights drinking and boasting by firelight while minstrels played. It was a careless life, one where the duties of the estate were likely a secondary concern to the oral pleasure of the lute. He spent more time by the Wear than in the chapel, which, from what we can tell, is essentially the best way to prepare for a disaster of biblical proportions. I find it interesting that he eventually became the first Earl of Durham, but for now, he's simply a young man with far too much free time and a very poor sense of risk assessment. One Sunday morning, John Lambton decided to go fishing instead of attending church. While families walked to prayer, he simply took up rod and line and wandered to the riverbank. On his way, some versions of the story tell us he was stopped by a venerable-looking stranger, perhaps a witch or an old man, who warned him that missing church on a Sunday would bring misfortune. John ignored the warning. He cast his line into the water and caught a peculiar eel-like creature, described as a worm. It was a nightmare creature, with a skin dark as oil, a body twisted like living rope, and a salamander-like head. Depending on the version, the worm was either thumb-sized or no bigger than 3 feet. It had narrow eyes with a cruel hunger, and ring upon ring of strange holes around its gaping mouth. John felt it was evil. He called the creature filth and threw the worm down a nearby well, discarding it into a deep, forgotten well. To him, it was just a thumb-sized devil. But to the worm, it was a home. It lived in the well, feeding on darkness, rot, and small life that strayed too near, allowing the creature to grow in strength and size. John Lambton didn't stay to see the consequences of his fishing trip. To repent for his profane ways, he left England for the Middle East to fight in the Crusades. He spent 7 long years in foreign wars, believing his penance was happening elsewhere. Meanwhile, back in County Durham, the creature he had discarded was not merely surviving, it was growing. The worm grew into a monster, reaching an awful size that the stone walls of the well could no longer contain. It emerged from the well, sliding toward the river, and it didn't just occupy the space, it was poisonous. The worm spread poison across the landscape, turning the water source into a toxin. While John Lambton returned from the Crusades after 7 years, he returned to a valley that had become a biological hazard. Livestock began to disappear first. The villagers noticed their animals were gone, only to discover the Lambton worm had finally emerged from the well and wrapped itself around a local hill. Depending on the version, the creature appeared either as a serpent or something with legs. It didn't just sit there. It wrapped itself around the hill at the Penshaw Monument site, coiling 7 times around the local hill. It was a logistical nightmare for the local community. The worm began to terrorize the area, snatching up children, sheep, and cattle. Cattle were found drained of milk and blood. It smashed forest trees like kindling with its thrashing tail, and destroyed crops, and caused farmers to flee their homes until the valley became silent. Eventually, the worm headed towards Lambton Castle, where John's elderly father, Lord Lambton, lived. Lord Lambton managed to sedate the creature, but the cost of peace was absurd. To appease the worm, he provided 91 gallons of milk a day, 20 imperial gallons, or 91 liters, filled in a trough. This required the milk of 9 good cows. Every single day, the castle's dairy output was essentially a gift to a giant milk-drinking serpent. Naturally, wandering knights and shining mail arrived to solve the problem. They did their best to kill the worm, but they were all killed by the beast. The knights tried to cut the worm into pieces, and the villagers watched as the beast was seemingly defeated. However, the worm had the ability to grow back parts of its body that had been chopped off. Every severed part wriggled and crawled back to rejoin the mass of flesh, allowing the beast to rise whole again. If a chunk is cut off, the worm could simply reattach the missing piece. Even if it were cut in half, the creature could pull itself back together and rejoin itself. While these knights failed, the worm continued its routine of destruction. It had the ability to uproot trees, using them as a club to swirl them around. It was a very efficient way to clear a forest. John Lambton returned from the Crusades after 7 years and found his father's estates decimated. The valley was broken, and the old Lord of Lambton had seen his estates almost destitute and impoverished. John knew the solution wouldn't be found in a military camp. No! He sought advice from a witch in Durham, specifically a wise woman living near Chesterless Street. This wise woman of Brugeford didn't offer comfort. She told John that the worm's existence was his fault and his alone. She stated plainly that his pride had poisoned this land and that brave swords alone would not mend it. Instead, she gave him a technical specification for survival. The witch advised John to put spearheads on his armor so the worm would be cut when it attacks. He commissioned armor studded thick with sharpened spearheads, preparing to face the beast in its own waters by the river. This adapted armor was designed to turn the creature's own strength into its downfall. John Lambton took his fight to the river, choosing a location where the creature rested during the daylight hours on a great rock midstream. This was Worm's Rock, a crag in the River Weir. John arrived strapping spearheads to his armor, preparing for the only way the beast could be killed. When the Lambton worm attacked, it did exactly what it always did. It squeezed. It wrapped around John, wrapping him in its coils, attempting to absolutely crush the man. But because of the armor's spikes, the worm cut itself to ribbons. As the beast squeezed, it shredded into pieces. John Lambton slays the worm, but the victory was only partial until the river's current took over. The severed pieces were washed away too quickly to be rejoined. The River Weir simply carried the debris of the worm away, preventing the regeneration. Victory, however, came with a very specific and rather grim requirement. The witch told John that to break the curse, he must kill the first living thing he saw after defeating the worm. This was not a suggestion, it was the price of spiritual cleansing. To avoid the curse, a hound was intended to be the first living thing killed. John agreed with his father that upon a signal, specifically 3 blows of a hunting horn, his father would release a dog to be killed by John to break the curse. After killing the worm, John sounded his hunting horn 3 times. He waited, But as the water cleared, his father, overcome with happiness, forgot the dog and ran out to embrace him. He simply forgot the vow. In a moment of a father's love, the same man who had promised to release his favorite hound forgot to release the hound. John couldn't bring himself to kill his father, and thus the family remained cursed. The first thing he saw was his father, and the vow was broken. Because John could not bring himself to kill the first living thing he saw, the witch's curse settled in. For 9 generations of the Lambtons family, the decree was simple. No chief of the Lambtons should die in his bed. It is said this held true for at least 3 generations, though the pattern continued much longer. Sir William Lambton, the 2nd generation of the curse, served as a colonel of foot and was killed at Marston Moor. Another William Lambton met his end in the battle at Wakefield. Another Robert Lambton drowned at Newrig. Finally, in 1761, Henry Lambton died in a coach crash while crossing Lamb Bridge, fulfilling the prophecy of the witch's curse with mechanical precision. The only way out was if John had killed the dog, but that window closed centuries ago. Looking at the wreckage of the family tree, the irony is quite clear. John saved the valley from a beast that demanded 91 gallons of milk a day, but he failed to save his own bloodline from a mistake made on a Sunday. He used spear-studded armor to shred a monster, but he could not shred a curse. The result was a sequence of violent deaths. Robert Lambton drowned, William Lambton fell at Marston Moor, and Henry Lambton died in a carriage crash at Lamb Bridge. This specific brand of nightmare has stayed with us because it was documented. The story of the Lambton worm is thought to date back to approximately the 14th century, though it first appeared in print in 1785, outlined by antiquarian William Hutchinson. By 1820, Durham historian Robert Surtis published it in the History and Antiquities of the County Palatine of Durham. Eventually, the tale became a folk song in 1867, written by Clarence M. Lumain in the Geordie Tyneside dialect for a Newcastle theatre. This ballad was later preserved in schools in the Northeast, ensuring that children learned about the worm while they were still young enough to believe in it. The monster is gone, but the legacy of the well remains. 1. Remove all section headers, e.g., /. Remove AI cliché transition words. Naturally, eventually, meanwhile, however, therefore, thus, moreover, indeed. Replace these transitions with conversational markers, e.g., and then, and the thing is, and so, and the weird part is. Break up long, complex sentences into shorter, punchier segments to ensure better TTS rhythm. Remove structural summary phrases like, looking at the wreckage of the family tree, the irony is quite clear. Ensure the narrator's voice remains deadpan and absurdist, avoiding any essay-style writing.